Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing incredibly well, and don't forget to go and get that fabulous drink, because I've got a lovely story for you tonight. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, it was the only way I could manage to survive. I was young, naive, vulnerable, exceedingly ignorant at the time, about 15 years old, violated, molested, abused by my foster father. My real parents handed me over to social services when I was born, as both of them were homeless dropouts, hopelessly addicted to narcotics, unable to take care of me, let alone even themselves, for their obnoxious, all-consuming, pervasive addiction had drained and guzzled their dreams faster than the tap water gushing down a plug hole. From thenceforth it would seem I was carted away from one desolate, sullen and cheerless foster home to another. Most of these loveless homes offered me little to no support, were only fostering to line their pockets still further with more money, not out of the gracious, generous goodness of their hearts. I ran away from my final foster home in Portsmouth, which is an independent city in Virginia's southwest, across the Elizabeth River from Norfolk. I absconded due to my obnoxious foster father, who had a fixation for underage girls. I knew that I couldn't face another day of his horrendous, unflagging abuse. Of course I told my foster mother what he was doing to me, but she didn't believe a word of it. "My husband would never do that," she insisted. "You're a nasty little liar, that's what you are." I knew by the conjecture on her face that she was fully aware of her husband's nightly visitations to my bedroom, that he conducted with a bold, obscene confidence that left me in no doubt that he had done this many times before, with other foster kids staying at his home. So it was a no-brainer for me to run away. Of course I was absolutely terrified. I did feel fragile, endangered, afraid, certainly about what the future held for me. But surely anything had to be better than living in an unconvivial, hostile environment with two people who treated me so impassively with a callous apathy. My story was not unlike the other impoverished, disadvantaged girls on my watch, who had fallen out of luck, ending up in prostitution, or with similar unfortunate accounts to tell of hard, punishing lives racked by sexual abuse, crippled by low self-esteem, driven by feelings of inferiority, inspired by desperation. It was a given that, much like myself, many of the working girls were lacking the quintessential employment skills that they would invariably need to acquire agreeable jobs in the workplace. Indeed, being underage certainly was a hazard, a stumbling block if you like, which meant doors of opportunity were slammed violently in your face. Most of the homeless girls, driven by financial necessity, drifted into this insidious, deceptive, guileful lifestyle like a piece of lumber floating in the water, drifting to wherever the current would take them. It was almost certainly like that for us, if we were desirous to survive, as the survival instinct tends to kick in very hard when you're struggling to stay afloat, and not to be throttled and consumed by the tsunami of challenges life can unleash upon you. For it was clear all choices or opportunities to advance ourselves in a positive way were permanently expunged from us. There was no knight in shining armour that would come to rescue us. We had to rescue ourselves, or we would never make it on the cruel, cold streets out there. Unfortunately, I ended up addicted to crack cocaine, like so many other young girls like myself. We were encouraged to take it by our clients and pimps alike. The big trouble with a drug like crack cocaine is that after trying it only once, you're ensnared. Much like a beaver caught in a trap, you can't escape its cunning allure. It meant that prostitution literally moored us like a boat docked in the marina so that we couldn't escape. Our addiction to drugs became a vicious cycle, as we needed to support a desperate habit that required incessant feeding like a hungry shark, or then you would have serious, unpleasant side effects. While I was on the crack cocaine, I felt as if I could conquer the world, which meant the insecurity inside me was somewhat suppressed. My oppressive, dysfunctional lifestyle became much more tolerable as I looked forward to the next high, pretty much lived for it actually, which meant I was completely enslaved by its powerful hold over my life. When I first arrived in Portland, a kind man, well, seemingly kind at the time, enticed me into his life like a fish at the end of a line. I was unsuspecting, naive, very, very gullible. The man was a pimp who lured me into his home under false pretences to ensnare me, as that's how they tend to operate. Slowly but surely I ended up on the street corner, selling my body in the age-old profession in Portland. It would seem that prostitution was first birthed in Burnside Street in the 1800s. Old Town was the area where prostitutes walked the streets, known as Whitechapel, named after London's waterfront, where Jack the Ripper began murdering prostitutes. It was a haven for brothels, gambling houses, saloons. Today it is still this part of Portland that is a pivotal spot for picking up girls of the night. I remember being whisked onto the streets by a pimp who took me under his charge, along with a few others. We would walk up the streets wearing short skirts, fishnet stockings, high-heeled shoes. People think prostitutes all have to look a certain way, but the truth is remarkably different, as size is never significant. It seems every man has his type, some who like the full, rounded figure, some like women to be obese, others like slimmer women, some athletic, boyish types. There's no cookie-cutter type, as most people wrongly assume. Then there are men who prefer women of colour or Oriental woman, while others like a regular-looking American white girl. Some like variety. It all depends, as the saying goes. Beauty is most definitely in the eye of the beholder. There are no hard and fast rules in this regard. And I know it sounds gross to talk about women like this, but this is the way it was in my industry. I did discern in those days that most of the punters would be very careful to choose women who they thought were less likely to rob them. Young girls were notorious for robbing their clients so that they could cut down on their street work significantly, as believe me, there is no pleasure in selling your body. I've heard that there are people that enjoy the lifestyle, but in my 15 years' experience of working the streets, I never met anyone who derived even an iota of pleasure from their job. If they told you they enjoyed it, it was probably a big fat lie, a guarded secret that only the insiders knew. You see, there's a lot of play acting involved in prostitution. You have to pretend you're happy, that you're enjoying yourself. Otherwise, if you're all miserable, your client will go somewhere else. No one wants to hook up with someone who has a hangdog expression on their face that says, "I'm miserable. I hate being here. I don't want to be here." Anything for sale needs to be appealing, otherwise no one's going to bite the bait or purchase the product. Like anything else in life, it has to come with some form of attraction. I do remember being a prostitute was the most demeaning job in the entire world. It increased my sense of self-loathing exponentially. I felt unclean, dirty, contaminated all the time. Then there was always that dreadful fear of developing a sexually transmitted disease that hung over my life like a looming dark thundercloud. I was terrified of this, but lucky that I had a streetwise pimp that was stringent about what we could and couldn't do with our clients, most of whom were blue-collar workers, working 9 to 5 during the week and on the weekends. Then they would hook up with prostitutes at cheap motels. My pimp wisely knew that if we ended up with a sexually transmitted disease, we would be as good for work as a stringy, dried-up old chicken trussed up and hanging up on a rotisserie hook in Chinatown. So he had a tough set of rules that needed to be adhered to at all times. Others weren't so lucky, as their pimps were so desperate for big bucks and big bucks quickly, that they didn't see the bigger picture, which meant girls were riddled with STDs, herpes, gonorrhea, HIV, you name it. And like old cars that ended up on the scrap heap, they became unable to work. In truth, after about 5 years of work, the average prostitute is pretty much burned out. It's a tough, gruesome life, and most certainly not for the faint-hearted. It was not long before I moved into a small apartment in Portland, which I shared with 3 other working girls, who became like sisters to me. Sadly, 2 of those girls are no longer alive today. Unfortunately, the cocaine addiction meant that those of us wishing to leave the profession knew that it was unlikely to ever happen, as our need for drugs consumed our lives. It literally was like Kool-Aid for us, an escape from the reality of what we were doing to ourselves. For let's not kid, prostitution can eat away at your soul like a weevil in a box of cereal. It is soul-destroying. Don't let anyone kid you otherwise. As a working girl, I did have my regulars. I preferred them over and above the unpredictable, arbitrary stranger. I knew what they required, their habits, their likes and dislikes. I was familiar, comfortable, and acquainted with their ways. For believe me, there were women who were beaten up, abused, even killed by strangers. It was a dark, egregious, unsavoury world, of which prostitutes' life held so little value for many, and many crimes against prostitutes had surreptitiously been covered and buried up like a squirrel's stash of acorns for the winter. I had one woeful customer who booked my services to talk. We do get customers like that. I like those. I felt so sorry for him. He told me that after his wife had died 10 years prior, he had become desperately lonely. He was shocked by how young I was, disgusted by the immoral, depraved men exploiting me, reminding me tirelessly that if they were intimate with me physically, they were committing statutory rape. Well, that was in the early days when I first started the prostitution before I got older. He picked me up to chat. He would take me to an ice cream parlour, treat me to milkshakes and waffles. He loved watching me eat. He would talk to me about his dead wife Agnes, and reminisce over the magical times that they'd spent together. I would hug him, hold his hand and talk. That was all he wanted from me. He would tell me some weekends were so incredibly lonely he wouldn't even talk to a single soul. I remember he gave me a gold chain with an opal pendant on it that had belonged to his wife. He said his wife would want me to have it because I'd saved his life. I still have it today. I wore it all the time, pretending it was fake so no one would steal it from me. I could never sell it, as it was so sentimental to me. I enjoyed talking to him. He was such a lovely man. I did have a few clients who were unhappily married, some staying in the relationships due to children, finances, religion, convenience, and all other kinds of reasons. Then those that were happily married but weren't feeling satisfied in the bedroom department or were looking for some excitement outside of their own marriage. Then there were the awful customers, men depraved, disreputable, degenerate, warped, seriously sick in the head, that we would avoid like the plague when we recognised their trucks or spotted them window shopping down the street, looking for a woman they could abuse, beat up and physically hurt. One day as I was standing on the street corner, desperately waiting for a punter to stop his truck to employ my services, for some reason the last couple of days had been very bad, with poor working opportunities. I was very desperate. I needed to procure some more cocaine. It was getting cold. I was beginning to shiver as blasts of cold air punnelled my body with a burning chill. It was late autumn, veering towards early winter, which isn't good news for a prostitute that wants to keep warm. I remember I was trembling with cold. I was wearing a skimpy short red tartan skirt, flimsy black top that came up to my belly button, a pair of knee-high black shiny plastic boots. I breathed a sigh of relief as my punter stopped his white truck, wound down the window, looking me up and down, and then asked me how much. Before I could even answer his question, he said, "Get in," in a raspy, deep voice. We hadn't even negotiated anything by then. But I still opened the passenger truck door, climbing into the seat beside him, nearly feeling more than a little hesitant, while the man pushed down the pedal of his accelerator and raced through the bright streets of Portland at one hell of a speed. I studied him curiously. Something about him was so nefarious it made me shudder. It gave me chills. He was large, a heavy-set man, wearing a white vest that revealed his powerful biceps that were heavily tattooed. He wore a thick gold chain around his neck, an expensive-looking watch on his wrist. I noticed he had a revolver on the dashboard. I do remember he was possibly in his 50s, with a scattering of brown hair on his head, very intense brown eyes that gave me the creeps. They were hostile, unkind, and downright mean. "Where are we going?" I asked. "Never you mind," he said. "You'll see when we get there." The slippery tone of his voice was very brutal, hard, devoid of any kindness. My heart sank like a heavy stone slipping to the bottom of a murky lake. I instinctively knew I shouldn't have got into the truck, as his intentions towards me were iniquitous, villainous, infernal. I sensed that instinctively within my gut. Warning bells began to ring in my head like blaring home alarm systems going off in the night. Part of me was screaming, "Get out of the truck! Get out of the truck now!" But he had switched on the internal locking system, so it was too late to hurriedly make my escape. I was trapped. "What's your name?" he barked. "Kylie," I said. "Kylie? I suppose it suits you. A good name for a tart." "I may be a prostitute, but I still have feelings, you know. You should treat me with some respect. You're incredibly rude." "Respect?" he said, spitting onto the windscreen. "Respect? You lost that kiddo when you started selling your body to all and sundry. You don't know the meaning of respect. You know nothing. You're like a cockroach." "Look," I said, "I don't think this is going to work out for both of us. I'd like to end the transaction now."
"Would you? I think you'll find that when you got into my truck, you authorised this transaction."
I said nothing, knowing full well if I challenged this perverse, unethical man, he might get rather violent with me. It certainly wasn't worth the risk. I'd seen too many prostitutes with black eyes, bludgeoned faces, broken teeth, bruised bodies, and that's if you were lucky. I realised the car had driven out of Portland. We were in the countryside, travelling down a remote country road, fringed by red maples and white oak trees on either side of the embankment, without a solitary soul in sight. "Why are you taking me into the countryside? Where are you taking me? I work in Portland, not in the countryside."
"You're about to fulfil my fantasy. That's why I hired you. Isn't that what a prostitute does? Create fantasies for their clients?"
I felt sick to the stomach. As whatever he wanted from me, it wasn't good. I suspected he'd beat me up, leave me with a black eye. I could sense I was in for a rough night. I began to emotionally prepare myself for being beaten up by this thuggish oaf. The truck pulled over to this rough dirt-lined clearing strewn with pebbles. The man pulled up the handbrake into park, pointing his revolver directly at me, yelling at me,
"Get out! Get out of my truck!"
"What are you going to do with me? You're not going to harm me, are you? Please, please," I begged. "Please don't hurt me." The man pushed me ahead of him.
"Move," he said. "Move."
It was a very dark night, but he had come prepared. He put a torch on his head and on mine, so that I could also see clearly. I remember we were walking into the heart of the woods, where tall trees towered up into the night sky. Their dense, dark, vertical forms seemed so menacing on this night, as they jiggled and swayed in the wind. I was relieved to see that there were walking trails, so I was tottering around in my knee-high boots that were certainly not designed to walk in precipitous, rugged places like this that were potentially rather treacherous. So I was tripping awkwardly while he kept shouting obscenities at me, calling me reprehensible names that I dare not repeat. I had no idea where we were. I remember it was deathly quiet. The stillness of the forest tormented me. It didn't feel natural. There were no chirping crickets, nor were there any croaking frogs. It was so quiet. All I could hear was the crunch of my own boots, as my soles squished the crunchy autumn leaves beneath my feet. The forest floor was just covered with dry, crunchy leaves from the oak trees, like a resplendent sea of gold. It was thanks to the open spaces between the boughs of the trees that gentle streams of moonlight flooded the forest floor, offering a measly measure of comfort, but not very much. My heart was racing at 100 miles an hour. I could feel it thumping in my chest like a booming drum. I could taste the bitter taste of nausea consuming the back of my throat, almost as if I was drinking an unripe grapefruit juice, only this was nasty. I knew the man was pointing a rifle behind my back as I stumbled ever forwards into the woods. Should I attempt running away? Would he shoot me, I wondered. Somehow I suspected he would, so I decided that the best course of action was to oblige his every need. Then maybe he would leave me alone. With luck I would emerge from this event unscathed, but all the more wiser. Before long we arrived at an open space in the woods, where a couple of fallen logs were laid out like a makeshift bed. The man commanded me to sit down. Then he pulled out a walkie-talkie speaker out of his pocket. I heard him say,
"Are you there, Dirk? Happy birthday, dude. Good, I've got her. Are you ready for a good time? Yes, she's a looker, but trashy looking. Young, just like you like them. Yes, innocent looking. Naive."
"Who's that?" I asked, looking alarmed. "Who you talking to?"
"You're a birthday present," said the man, leering at me. "I'm going to sit back and watch while my friend takes great pleasure in beating you up to a pulp, finishing you off, burying you beneath the forest floor, until all those leaves are covering you completely," he said, smiling at me maliciously. I knew I had absolutely nothing to lose, so I attempted to run away as fast as I could, but the man quickly pulled out his revolver and shot me directly in the ankle.
I could feel a warm, hot heat pulsate through my left boot, launching into my ankle like a steel missile. The pain was excruciating. I writhed in agony. I do not recall a time of greater pain than this. I screamed out in distress. My screams morphed into wails that were carried on the wind like a high-pitched emergency siren.
"That's better," said the man. "I think you are nicely immobilized. You shan't be able to run away."
Then I saw another man moving towards me through the woods, with an odious smile on his face. He leered at me approvingly.
"Now she's a tasty morsel. She'll do nicely," he said, giving me the once-over with a soulless pair of dark eyes. He then gave his friend an approving high five. By this stage I seriously wanted to throw up, vomit, be violently sick. I might have been a prostitute, but I hadn't asked for any of this. But when working in such a spiritually impoverished profession like mine, you're rarely exposed to the real dredges of society, the gutter rats that run down the sewers, using the shadows of darkness to keep their treacherous deeds at bay. It is these kinds of people few get to see, but they are out there, looming in the dark corners, their minds buzzing with iniquitous fantasies that would make the vast majority of us feel completely revolted. But as a prostitute, I had seen the unforgiving brutality of this heinous profession. I was still screaming at the two men at the top of my lungs to let me go. I didn't want any part of this. This isn't what I'd signed up for. The man began to undress, the one that had been given me as his birthday present, so to speak, piling his clothes into a neat pile, taking care to fold them up very neatly. The next thing I knew was that the forest began to boom. Something thundered through the forest at an alarming speed. Whatever it was, it picked up momentum like a boisterous wind, but the vibration of the footfall was so substantial that the only way I can describe it was something hefty was moving towards us. You just knew that instantly. It was big, portentous, dangerous, lethal, threatening, as its movements were like an unwritten signature that left you in no doubt that something quite dreadful was about to unfold. It was in those moments it was like time stood still, clasping back valuable seconds with a fervent hunger. It was like everything else beyond the booms and the vibrations was almost suspended like beads and globules of jelly, momentarily disabling one's ability to react. It was like we were all gripped in what I can only describe as a stunned stupor that disorientates, immobilizes, paralyzes you. One of the men said, "Brady, what the heck is that?" The expression on their faces was one of unadulterated, consummate terror. Then we saw her. She fixed her all-knowing, sagacious, deep-set dark eyes on both men, with an infinite, astute, discerning look, as if she was in no doubt what was going on. The formidable, anomalous creature looked like a wild woman, only in massive proportions, built like a giant, in width, girth, and weight, towering at easily 8 foot tall, with shoulders as wide as a front door. I noticed her legs were long, lean and muscular. Her overlong arms trailed beyond her knees. She was covered from head to toe with long flowing hair, of a very pale auburn hue, like a pretty strawberry blonde colour. The leathery skin on her face was a tawny salmon brown. I knew she was female, for she possessed 2 very small pert breasts. She was the most intimidating, terrifying creature that I've ever beheld. She was angry, very angry. Her deep dark eyes raged like burning coals of fire. Her face was incredibly human. She pulled back her lips and began to roar. The man called Dirk was blocking his ears. The sound was ear-piercingly loud. He tried desperately to run. The other one who had picked me up, called Brady, was now reaching for his revolver. The creature's keen, fast eyes travelled swiftly to his gun like a tiny plane landing on an airstrip with remarkable precision. She grabbed the revolver from him unhesitantly, with a swiftness faster than the speed of our thoughts, and threw it somewhere in the underbrush, lunging towards Brady with a powerful stride. She seized Brady with such a brute force. I've never seen anything like it. He looked tiny, fragile, pathetic, rather like a fragile Ken doll. He was screaming as she picked him up in her hands, throwing him towards the tree, where he hit the hefty trunk like a wall of cement. He groaned in agony as he fell backwards to the ground with a laborious thud. She then moved towards him, twisting his neck, so that now his glazed, empty eyes were staring at me back to front. The other man was screaming as he struggled to get away. "No! No! No!"
He was almost begging the creature to stop, not to hurt him, but compassion she showed him not. She grappled the man easily, as if she was picking apples off a tree. And this man, let me tell you, was by no means small. She snapped his neck, twisting it around back to front like a cork in a wine bottle. The two men were now lying there deceased. I didn't care at all. She trotted over to me with such a loving look in her eyes that I knew her intentions towards me were kind. She had heard my screams and protectively come to my rescue. She gently touched my head, looking at me in my eyes like a protective mother. I began to sob and sob. She reached over to rock me in her arms, cradling the back of my neck and cupping my head in her chest. It was funny, she smelt so nice, reminding me of petrichor, how the earth smells after the rain. I kept saying, "Thank you, thank you. You saved my life." I believe she understood what I was saying. The creature soon realized that I couldn't walk, as I tried to raise myself on the ground but began to whimper in agony as I hobbled all over the place. I could see she was thinking as she scratched her head in deep contemplation, looking at me as if wondering how she could possibly help me. Then she picked me up in her arms after having made a decisive decision and carried me through the woods. I knew that to her I was as light as a feather. She did not struggle as she moved through those woods speedily, never jolting or staggering for a single moment, for if she had done so, the insufferable pain would have been intolerable, as my ankle was throbbing wildly. It was a dark, insipid, soundless night, but I wasn't remotely afraid. I knew I could trust this wild woman with my life. She was intelligent, discerning, incredibly gentle. I remember she glided with me so graciously through the woods. The ride was smooth. It seemed like we were floating on air at times, despite the fact that she did climb up some rugged terrain, through some sagebrush, into a meadow with cows that upon seeing us made a mooing commotion, hurriedly trotting away to the edge of the field. They were clearly intimidated by her, but despite their angst, they watched us curiously while chewing their cud, as we ambled through the field. Before long, in the dark shadows, I saw the silhouette of a farmhouse with one outside light still left on. The creature lowered me to the ground outside the farmer's front door, indicating for me to get help. I thanked her as I watched her gliding away into the trees. My heart was filled with awe and wonder, for I knew beyond question she had saved my life. The door was opened by a very kindly-looking man with a full head of grey hair, wearing blue and white pinstripe pyjamas. He looked startled to find me at his front door, very concerned. I explained I'd been shot in the ankle, so he immediately called for the ambulance, looking rather bewildered that I'd managed to arrive at his front doorstep on a gammy leg like that. I was also beginning to sweat profusely and shake, as I was desirous for some crack cocaine, but I received help at the hospital while undergoing an operation to remove the bullet and to repair my shattered ankle. While I was in hospital, I was referred to a place where I could receive treatment for my crack addiction. I'm so lucky because I came off the drugs seamlessly compared to other less fortunate people than myself. Even my therapist was amazed, describing me as one of their quickest breakthroughs that she'd ever seen. I never returned to my life of prostitution, nor the crack cocaine, as the centre where I was rehabilitated from found me a job, which morphed into my being promoted in the company from a very mediocre position into a sales executive, so I never ever looked back. The two men's bodies were recovered from the woods. I heard about it on the radio. The death was described as bizarre and macabre. I still believe those men intended to kill me after they'd beaten me up. I have no doubt about that in my mind. I was to learn that both of those men were ex-convicts, so I guess I shouldn't have been surprised by their atrocious, contemptible treatment towards me. When I met the man I was to marry on a camping holiday with one of my work friends, I came clean to him about my life of prostitution. It hit him hard like a brick to the face. He didn't take it at all well. It made him angry and enraged. He eventually came around to accepting that part of my life, where I had made a living selling my body, but it did torment him for a long time. Please don't judge people too harshly for some of the decisions they choose to make in life in order to survive. It can be a tough, hard world out there, with many people like myself, lost souls down on their luck, falling victim to this insidious dark world. I have so much compassion for anyone caught up in this lifestyle, for it is rare to find anyone who enjoys what they do. I am appreciative for an anonymous forum like this on which I can share my story. I want to tell you that the creature that saved my life was definitely a Bigfoot, It was easy for her to kill those 2 men, but I promise you she knew exactly what she was doing. It was like she could see into the depths of their heart and sense that they were very bad men. The world is a much better place without them, I assure you. So there you are. That's my story.
Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.